Hi, everybody. I am Dr. Renfro, and today we are going to be talking about election security and specifically the security surrounding voting by mail. Let me share my screen with you here. Okay. All right. So, voting by mail. So far, this has been a really big year, perhaps unsurprisingly, or really unsurprisingly. This has been a really big year so far for voting by mail. Um, it's becoming more and more common every year for people to want to vote in kind of non-traditional, not, on election day kind of days. And then the coronavirus, of course, put us in a situation where many Americans simply just don't feel safe going and standing in line and waiting to vote. Here in Iowa, and specifically in the part of Iowa where we are right now in Cedar Falls, we're very lucky. We have a good number of polling locations to where it's very rare that you would have to wait long at all to vote. And that's just simply not true in a lot of parts of the country. And so, the idea of standing in line for hours and hours and hours with, hundreds or thousands of your closest neighbors, is never all that fun. Trust me, I used to live in Los Angeles. I did that. I stood in line with I guess she would have been 10-month-old daughter. I stood in line for 3 hours at a nursing home so that she could be with me to vote, for the first election that she was alive for. And that was all exciting and everything, but it was still standing in line for a really long time with a 10-month-old baby with me. And if coronavirus had been a thing at the time, well, first of all, everybody just would have died or something because I was at a nursing home. That's where the polling location was. And so I was in line with a bunch of really old people. And like the lady that I kept chatting with who was in line by me, when she was born, women didn't have the legal right to vote. So she was clearly of an age where she would have been maybe a little at risk for catching a disease like the Rona. So this year, up to about 80 million people are expected to vote by mail in this election, which is far, far more than has ever happened before. In fact, like today, while I'm recording this, so today I think we're 12 days out, something like that, from the election, and we've already surpassed all early voting that's ever happened in an election year before. So like we're coming out strong in the voting by mail and early voting so far already. There is quite a bit of variation though how this works state by state. So elections and election laws are largely left up to the states. In the Constitution, it says when it says what date the presidential election is going to take place on, and then when the transition is going to happen. But the manner of actually doing the elections is left up to the states, and the states get to pick pretty much everything except for the dates. And so if any of you have ever moved, from state to state, you might have seen this. A lot of you won't have moved yet, and especially not during the time period when you've been old enough to vote. But if you do in the future, you'll see that there is quite a bit of variation in how voting works from state to state. So, like for our purposes of this conversation, for example, there are 5 states where there is no voting by mail at all unless you have a really good reason. And being afraid of or being particularly susceptible to COVID doesn't count as a reason. So, if you're, paralyzed and don't have a way of getting to the polls, that might count, something like that. But being like, oh, I'm compromised and I am afraid that I'm going to catch coronavirus isn't going to get you an absentee ballot in these 5 states. So these are like the hardest core states. And then, the next level, kind of it jumps quite a bit. So, you can request a mail-in ballot, and you don't need a reason at all, or COVID is a good enough reason, which is practically the same thing as saying that you don't need a reason because COVID is everywhere. And so this list is much longer. Alaska, Montana, Idaho, North Dakota, New Mexico. I mean, and all over the country, spread out all over the place. So you have to request that ballot, though. You have to either fill out an application or go down and tell somebody, or go online and request to have a ballot sent to you. In the next group of states, of which Iowa is included, the ballot applications are automatically sent to everyone. So if you are a registered voter in the state of Iowa, a ballot application or multiple ballot applications were sent to your address that is listed with your voter registration. So you might be sitting here in your dorm room in Cedar Falls, but maybe you're registered to vote at your parents' house. Your parents would have received your ballot application if you didn't know if you got one or not. If you are a registered voter there, they got your ballot application, not your ballot. Iowa did not send out ballots to everyone. They sent out ballot applications to everyone, which is also why it's maybe kind of confusing or maybe kind of obnoxious that many of us, myself included, received many ballot applications. I think I got like 4 ballot applications because I got like one that they sent, I don't even know, I think the state or the county, and then I think that my political party maybe sent one. I got a bunch of them is all I know. And it's do-gooders trying to make sure that everybody who's, in an abundance of caution, staying home and trying to avoid getting sick or getting other people sick, that everybody is still getting their constitutional right to vote. And so they're sending those out, but they're just applications. So it's okay if you get 4 of them. That's not fraud of any sort, because even if you fill out all 4, they all go to the same place where then somebody goes to check off that, okay, it's time to send Jayme a ballot. Oh, well, we already got hers. So like, cool, we're just going to discard this one. They match it up by your name and your address, and they have all of your information that you wrote down when you registered as a voter. So they know to discard any additional applications that you send. That's not fraud. There are a handful of states, well, actually kind of more than a handful: Washington, Oregon, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Vermont, New Jersey, DC. And then in Montana, it's a county by county choice where they actually do send ballots to everyone. And so you don't have to send in your ballot request. You don't have to ask for one. You just get your ballot in the mail. This is the one. This is where it gets a little bit, where these states are kind of opening themselves up to criticism a little bit more, where people maybe are a little bit more afraid of the potential for fraud, because there are ballots just being sent through the mail out to everyone who's a registered voter. So like, wouldn't it maybe be easy to get a hold of someone else's, or to fill someone else's out, or to snatch them right back out of the mail, or, all of those sorts of things. And those are some of the allegations that have been coming up recently, including some of the concerns that have come out of President Trump. So if you remember back during the first presidential debate, which seems like a million years ago, but was actually like 3 weeks ago or something, he spent quite a bit of time actually talking about voting by mail. There's a quote. He said, "This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen." And he brought up a bunch of examples. and they're real examples. These are not made up things. There was a case of Philadelphia officials preventing election monitors from observing voters filling out their ballots. There is an example of military ballots being found in the trash, that when they were recovered were, I think most of them were found marked for Trump. Um, in New York, there was a very slow count. In a lot of places, there was a very slow count, but in New York, it was what he was talking about. There was a very slow count. Um, and the primaries in June of all of those ballots that came in by mail. And he alleges that that means that at least one of them, and he specifically called out Carolyn Mahoney, that meant it was fraudulent, that there was necessarily a problem because the count went so slow. And he also brought up an example of a West Virginia mail worker selling ballots. So, you also have to remember that President Trump votes by mail, because he is a registered voter from his home in Florida, not from his kind of temporary working home in Washington, D.C. And some people might say that that's an example of hypocrisy. Like, how dare you say that mailing in your vote is necessarily like fraudulent, but then you do it yourself? Well, President Trump seems to be drawing a clarification between absentee voting and voting by mail. So, like, what he said is a solicited ballot is okay. You're soliciting, you're asking, they send it back, you send it back. I did that. They're sending millions of ballots all over the country. There's fraud. All right, that sentence is a little all over the place, but I think a lot of us have gotten used to the way that he talks, and I'm not even gonna like try to like do an impression of his style of talking or anything. But it seems like what he's doing is like, okay, yeah, if you ask for a ballot, if you request a ballot specifically, and then that ballot is sent to you, you fill it out, and then you send it back, that's different than when they send out ballots to everyone, that there's maybe less room for fraud or problems if people are requesting a ballot like he did. But here's the deal. It doesn't really matter, that distinction, because those ballots are handled in the same way. Whether you request an absentee ballot or that absentee ballot is just sent to your house, they're handled in the same way. When I lived in California, so I did vote in person a couple of times. The one time that I took my daughter to vote for president because it was all symbolic and I wanted to put the little sticker on her, for her first one and all that. But mostly I did not want to go vote in person in California because the lines are long. And in California, they had, I don't know if they're going to continue with the sending out ballots to everyone, but they used to have at least just a permanent absentee. You could be a permanent absentee. You sign up for this list and then they always send you a ballot. So like you requested, I solicited all ballots for the future. Or you could just solicit one, or you could so they're not handled any differently. The security is all the same. All of the measures that they take to make sure that they're all counted, like all of that's the same. So like, yeah, there is kind of a semantic difference between a solicited, like an absentee ballot, and just like kind of more general vote by mail. But in practice, there isn't really much of a difference. And part of the reason that we know this is because this isn't new. There is extensive research on this. So unlike the novel coronavirus, which was, new to us. Um, Voting by mail, I mean, certainly in the numbers that we're seeing right now, but voting by mail, just generally, we've had it since forever. If you think, the military has always voted by mail. We have always had a mechanism so that troops who are away from their polling places have been able to vote by mail. That has always been a thing. So we have literally hundreds of years of records on that. And there is essentially no fraud involved in any of that. And you might say, oh, well, it's the military, it's different, and security, and I don't know, integrity, even maybe, or something. And okay, maybe, because maybe the security is different, and maybe the fact that those post offices are not just general access post offices, and maybe there is something to that. But it's only been since 1998 that's when Oregon moved to all mail voting, all the time, all mail. Um, and so we have 22 years worth of data on every single election in Oregon. So not just the every 4 years presidential elections, and not just also the every 2 years House elections, and not just the gubernatorial election, but every level of government, every single time there is any voting for anything. It's all done by mail. And so there's lots of room, lots and lots of room to study just Oregon, going back a really long time. And other states have added since. And what we have found is the voting fraud is so exceedingly rare that it almost statistically doesn't exist. It does exist anecdotally. And I don't mean anecdotally meaning like, somebody told a story about somebody who told a story. Like, that's not even what I mean. Like, there are legitimate cases of people being prosecuted and found guilty of voter fraud. Absolutely, it happens. But when you're looking at it numerically, compared to how many votes get cast, statistically, it is basically non-existent. So different places have done studies, researchers, academic type researchers, law for like law school, the Brennan Center for Justice is the law school, is part of the law school at NYU, newspaper journalists, those sorts of researchers, and all kinds of people have done research. The government itself, I mean, the Congressional Research Services, there have been on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democratic task forces that have looked at this kind of stuff. And no study that exists has ever found voter fraud to actually be something to be concerned with on a practical level. On a moral level, maybe, because on a moral level, you could maybe say that any instance of somebody doing something wrong is something to be concerned with. So sure, but that's kind of a different question. So the Brennan Center for Justice that I was just talking about at NYU, they found that most reported incidents of voter fraud are actually traceable to other sources like clerical errors or bad data matching. And even that is where between 0.0003 and 0.0025% of ballots cast. So that's not 3% or 22.5% even. That's 0.0003%. I mean, that is infinitesimal. That is so tiny. So then Columbia University did another look at a slightly different data set. And they actually found that of the instances of fraud that were found, so like if you look through newspaper reports, you can use the system called LexisNexis, and you can look through newspaper reports looking for instances of fraud and then trace them and find out what happens. Did they get prosecuted? Did it find to be like a mistake? Like what happened? And what the researchers at Columbia found is that many of those instances, most of those instances, can be traced to either false claims by a losing candidate, mischief, meaning like just somebody's messing with somebody, or error. So like the types of clerical or data matching errors that New York University found above. The Washington Post found that looking between 2000 and 2014, there were more than 1 billion ballots cast, because, we vote, there are 300 and not quite 350 million of us. And not all of those people vote, but we have more than one election. And so anyway, 1 billion ballots cast in that, well, it's 15-year time period. In that 15-year time period, they found only 31 credible instances of impersonation fraud. So like somebody going and being like, oh, I'm Jim Smith and I'm here to vote. And these 31 were including all of the claims of impersonation fraud, not just prosecutions. So the claims would be like the bigger number. And if you looked at the prosecutions, it ended up being like 1 out of 1 billion. Dartmouth did a review of the 2016 election. If you paid attention to, I was going to say the news, but really it isn't even exactly the news. If you paid attention to any of the icky rumors and vitriol that was thrown around about the 2016 election, 3 million fraudulent voters in California who aren't even citizens, blah, blah, all that stuff. Dartmouth University, which is an Ivy League school and very much not known for being super liberal, a group of researchers did a review of that whole election and found four instances of voter fraud in that entire 2014 election. I could keep going. I mean, there are so many studies, so many studies, because the rumors of voter fraud are rampant. They come up all the time, and everybody seems to have a story. Well, my mom's cousin knows this guy who voted 4 different times. No, they don't. Oh, well, my roommate voted in her hometown and here at UNI. Probably not. I mean, maybe, but probably not. Because voter fraud is just really, really rare. And all of these studies, even the ones that are kind of trying to find it, like for their own kind of political oomph, don't find it. And the courts agree. I guess to back up just a little bit, a few years ago, some laws changed where now the southern states don't have to be monitored as closely for being racist. Ever since the Civil War until just a few years ago, we were really looking close at those southern states to make sure that they weren't screwing over Black folks too much. And just a few years ago, the Supreme Court was like, it's been long enough. They're probably fine now. And so we let them start to do some stuff, and some other court cases were happening, and suddenly all of these voter ID laws started to get passed. Including here in Iowa. And in some of the reviews of those laws, the courts were like, well, why do you want to have this? And then the attorney who was arguing for the voter ID laws would be like, to prevent fraud. And then the judge would be like, well, like what kind of fraud? Because it seems to me like the only kind of fraud that could be prevented by showing your driver's license is the kind of fraud like where somebody shows up and does like in-person impersonation fraud. The whole, hi, I'm Joe Smith and I'm here to vote. Um, and the lawyer would be like, yes, we are trying to prevent that. Make sure everybody's who they say they are. Well, the Fifth Circuit in Texas was like, well, there have only been 2 convictions for that out of 20 million votes in the past 10 years. So are you sure you want to have a whole law that's going to be hard on a lot of people just to stop 2 out of 20 million? Like, does that even make sense? And then like the Fourth Circuit in North Carolina, they couldn't even find that. They said, well, the North Carolina failed to identify even one single case, not even one single case in the entirety of North Carolina's history who had ever been charged with committing in-person voting fraud. Never even one. And North Carolina still wanted to pass a voter ID law. And then when the Supreme Court was hearing the case that ended up actually upholding Indiana's law, they noted that the record contained zero evidence of any in-person voter impersonation ever occurring in Indiana at any time in its entire history. So again, there is no evidence that it had ever happened there, but they were still trying to pass a law to stop something that had never happened. Little quick side note on that, the Supreme Court did uphold that law. However, after it was all said and done, 2 different justices came back and said that they regretted their decision in that case and shouldn't have done it. They realized afterward that it was going to have a disproportional effect on people of color and poor people, and the fact that there was zero evidence that it had ever been a problem, that they never should have done that. Chris Kobach, he was the Secretary of State in Kansas, kind of a darling of the GOP. He's a big Trump team player, I guess. They like it. It goes both ways. They really like each other. So his name comes up a lot. But he was pretty sure that he knew personally about a lot of very terrible voter fraud going on around the whole country, not even just in Kansas. And so he asked for some like special power to prosecute all of this terrible fraud. And so he reviewed, and he got this whole team of really amazing researchers and attorneys together, and they reviewed 84 million votes cast in 22 different states, and ended up referring 14 cases for prosecution. 14 out of 84 million is a 0.0000017% fraud rate. I mean, it's 14 people who committed fraud. Don't get me wrong. It's people who did bad things and who should be in trouble for having done a bad thing. That's not the point I'm trying to make here, is that people should, like, not trying to say in any way that people like should get away with something. But we spent an awful lot of money to pay Chris and his team to study this and to investigate this, and it just ended up not being a thing, which shouldn't have been a surprise, because all of those studies that I talked about before predated this, and we knew this already. And then there's another example in 2012, Florida, the governor said that there were almost 200,000, like something like 198,000 non-citizens registered to vote in the state of Florida. And so he put together a task force, because that's what you do. You put together a task force to get to work fixing that. And so they got that list of names and started going through it and doing some investigating. And within just a few days, that 200,000 list narrowed down to 200, 198 more specifically. And then that 198 went down again pretty quickly to 85. The final list was 85. And then even of that 85, 84 of them were found to have just made a mistake, or that a mistake was made in their name. And by the end of the whole thing that cost millions of dollars to investigate, they found one person to get in trouble for purposely registering when they were not supposed to. So that is one person out of 12 million voters. So that's a very long-winded but hopefully convincing way of telling you that, like, that we have a good idea that rampant, widespread voter fraud just really isn't happening. There are other things to be concerned about in terms of election security. And if we want to talk more about election security, I'll do a whole nother one about the Internet of Things and the voting box, the ballot boxes, and using the electronic ones. Oh, we can do a whole nother one about that if you want me to. But this version of people committing voter fraud, it's a person here, a person there. Yes, there are real instances of real people doing actually bad things, but we're talking out of millions and billions of votes cast. And we do a lot of things, particularly with the voting by mail, to prevent this kind of fraud. So with the voting stuff, voting by mail stuff, some of the things we do, we mail the ballots only to the official address that is listed on the registration roll. So you can't have your ballot mailed to your school address if you're actually registered at your parents' house. Like, it's going to go to your parents' house. They could probably mail it then to you. They could forward it to you or whatever. But it's going to go to your parents' address. Or if you move, but you haven't updated your registration, it's not going to automatically follow. Like, you have to change your address in your registration. And it's just one of the ways that we make sure that the ballot gets to the right person. We require signatures on the external envelope so that the ballot can't be taken out and then put in a different envelope or something. You have to sign the outside of the envelope, like certifying that you're voting and that's yours and whatever. And then when they receive it, the election officials match the ballot to the name and address on the registration roll, and often also to the signature. So they'll look and see if your signature on your envelope matches your signature on your registration. That part's a little tricky because, like, let's be honest, who signs their name the same every time? Or, like, if you're trying to sign your name nice and actually, like, putting in the letters because you're registering to vote for the first time, so you're doing it nicely, versus you were in a hurry, like scribble before you throw it in the mailbox. Like, and there have been some problems with that, with ballots being rejected. So the opposite of voter fraud, the way that we're talking about right now, like ballots that should be legit being rejected because the signatures don't match, and it was just a sloppy handwriting day problem. And then also online tracking. So it was interesting. I voted by mail this year, and let's see, I received my ballot on, like, let's say October 5th. And so I filled it out and mailed it back on October 6th. And then they received it, and I had a confirmation. Like, I went onto the Secretary of State's website and put in my name and everything, and I had a confirmation that they received it on the 8th. And so, like, I could track it, and I knew when they had it. And so, like, if they hadn't shown up, like if they hadn't said that they had it on a certain date or whatever, I would have known that there was a problem. But now I know that they had it and it got counted. And again, all of this has worked for a long time. The military, again, like, we've been doing this forever, Oregon for a long time now, and like, just really not much of a problem. And in fact, Oregonians really like it. It's convenient for them. And we've gotten to learn a lot about best practices, kind of how to do it, how much time it takes, what kind of instructions you need to give people, like how to make it easier and more understandable for voters, and also easier and more doable on the part of the people who are counting. And this is important because it's important to understand how not common this kind of voter fraud is, because it is being repeated so much right now, and it is being repeated by the President of the United States. And I'm not going to venture a guess about his motivations for doing that. I don't know what is in his head or in his heart. But what I can tell you is that repeating false or kind of misusing small anecdotes to make them seem like they're a much bigger deal can end up making it harder for millions of eligible Americans to participate in elections. There is a long history in this country of racially suppressing voting. And a lot of that was justified with, oh, we're stopping voting fraud. And that voting fraud wasn't happening in the first place, and neither is this voting fraud. And so things like voter ID laws, it might not seem like a big deal to a lot of you because you have your IDs, and kind of whatever, like it, and it doesn't seem like a big deal to a lot of people. And that's awesome that you've never been in a situation where having an ID would be a big deal. And another example of this is in Texas, they put out ballot drop boxes so that you can just like go and put it in a drop box instead of putting it in the mail, for people who were nervous about putting it in the mail. And we have one of those, by the way, at Blackhawk County, out by the courthouse, if you want to use that. But there were, at the beginning, there were lots of drop boxes, and depending on how populated your area was, there were like lots of drop boxes and places to put your ballots. But the governor of Texas like changed the rule and said that because of the potential for fraud, that now there was only going to be one drop box per county. Well, we're talking about Texas here. Texas contains like something like 5 of the top 20 most populated cities in the country. And so one drop box per county means that you're having millions and millions of people in some places and one drop box, making it harder for millions of eligible Americans to participate in elections. So just in terms of integrity, claims that the election is rigged is not great. Eroding public trust in institutions for political gain is not great. And we should not do it. But we can't control what other people say. But what we can do is inform ourselves enough that you can know that pretty much every single academic study has come to similar conclusions that voter fraud, when it comes to impersonation or mail-in fraud, is practically inexistent, that it's so rare. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you later.